Good morning and welcome to the Ministry of Housing, a digital workshop series empowering houses of worship to understand the real estate development process. Join us every Tuesday, now April the 9th through May 7th. This program is a partnership between the San Francisco Interfaith Council and DCG Strategies. Today's program is how to partner with an architect, and you're going to learn about the roles an architect plays in the development process, from initial renderings to site planning and density studies. We're excited to welcome Paul McElwee, principal at HKIT Architects, who will share best practices for working with architects and provide input in architectural processes and a whole lot more. We're excited to welcome him. A special thanks. The Ministry of Housing Workshop Series is supported by a grant from the San Francisco Foundation. A bit of housekeeping. Today's program is being recorded. For audio and video, all participants are muted and without video to minimize distraction. For chat, you can submit a question or comment by selecting the chat button at the bottom of your screen and sending a message to Q&A. Questions will be answered and will be forwarded to the host and answered time permitting. For closed captions, select the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and click Enable Live Transcription. And at this time, I'd like to hand the floor over to the Executive Director of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, Michael Pappas. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Trey. Good morning. I'm Michael Pappas, Executive Director of the San Francisco Interfaith Council, and on behalf of the SFIC and our collaborating partner, DCG Strategies, I want to welcome you to this second segment in a 6-week series entitled The Ministry of Housing. As was mentioned, this series is made possible by a generous grant from the San Francisco Foundation. According to San Francisco Planning Department records, there are 800 properties in our city owned by religious entities, many of which are underutilized and whose faith communities are struggling financially. At a time when San Francisco is in dire need of more and affordable housing, the leadership of these entities also recognize the moral obligation to be responsible stewards of their properties in order to provide for the greater good. In response to these needs, at the height of the tech boom and soaring real estate prices, the most prominent faith leaders in San Francisco gathered and formed the Interfaith Essential Housing Task Force. Collaborating with and drawing upon the generous wisdom of DCG Strategies, this task force seeks to achieve its vision of helping diverse constituencies transform their real estate assets so that those properties may realize their potential and help provide the sorely needed housing for San Franciscans who otherwise could not afford to live here and thus would be forced to relocate. Building upon the highly successful recent in-person workshop of the same name, this series is designed to cast a wider net in assisting and supporting congregations and religious institutions contemplating developing their properties for affordable housing. Realizing that developing property in a city like ours can be daunting and is not the primary field of expertise of congregation leaders, it is our hope that the curriculum being offered in this series will provide the unique opportunity for attendees to learn from leading industry experts, including architects, affordable housing finance specialists, developers, attorneys, and the San Francisco Planning Department. Explore public and private funding solutions to support development, and learn ways to partner with real estate professionals to reach their goals. Before I close, I would encourage all of you to listen carefully to our speaker today, and don't be shy in offering questions to Q&A, because your question might be of benefit to others on the line. We thank you for taking the time to join us in what promises to be an invaluable learning opportunity. And at this time, it gives me great pleasure to introduce friend and valued colleague, Landis Graydon, founder and principal of DCG Strategies.
Thank you, Michael. And good morning, everyone. I'm glad you were able to join us this morning. We're really excited about this second installment of the Ministry of Housing, the online series, and just a special recognition to Michael Pappas for having this vision. Michael and I have been working together for nearly a decade, and one thing that's been consistent is Michael is passionate about making sure faith communities are supported, and his vision to bringing this online and making it accessible is a gift. And I just want to thank you, Michael, for that. Just recapping where we started last week. We started last week talking about, is there a there there? And why that's important is because, there are a lot of variables. Housing is very complex, a lot of variables inside houses of worship. And the one thing we don't want is for there to be wasted resources, wasted time, and anything that can interrupt the core mission of the organization. And so when there is this notion to take on housing as a ministry, the idea is to empower you so that you are able to show up informed, show up from a position of strength and knowledge, and participate fully. And there are plenty of stories why that's important. And so last week we talked about, is there a there, because that's where we start. We don't advise rushing out and going immediately into development. We believe that you first need to make sure that the site can support development, to make sure that there's internal alignment within the organization, and several other things. I would encourage you to revisit the video from last week. We also emphasize that it's best practice for the organization to have your representative who understands the fundamentals of housing. So if you have someone that's willing to give up time pro bono, or if you find a consultant that you can hire as an owner rep, we think it's critical that you have someone on your team that understands the fundamentals, that understands all the various components and disciplines, and that you're able to show up in a way where you're going to be able to get the maximum benefit from housing. And so as we explore, is there a there, meaning, can the site legally support housing? Can the site physically support housing? As an organization, are we internally aligned? Have we looked at whatever our governance structure is and make sure there's that type of support? And as we conclude that initial evaluation, that, we believe that we have a site that works. We believe that the site can contain a certain amount of density. Then the next thing we do is we seek to engage an architect. And the architect is where we always start, and the architect is a through line through the entire process. And we wanted to have this conversation so that you understand what goes on behind the scenes when architects are engaged, and what their core responsibilities are, and how you yourself are in a position to have contribution into that relationship, as well as understand implications of, if you have a certain vision, how that translates to financial responsibilities, et cetera, et cetera. So we went out and got a great architect to bring here and be able to just expound on, what architects do, how they fit on the team, how you work with them. And again, the notion is to empower you to show up in the relationship as your properties develop, as opposed to just being a passenger, not really understanding what's going on, and relegated to just a witness. And maybe you are fortunate enough to get the maximum benefit, but oftentimes we find that organizations may not. So with that being said, Paul, if you'd like to introduce yourself, and then we can launch into our conversation.
Well, thanks, Landis. And I'll be looking forward to meeting that great architect someday. But in the meantime, is everyone able to see my screen presentation? I got a nodding heads. Good.
And maybe turn up your volume just a tinch.
Well, welcome, everyone. I am Paul McElwee, and thank you, Michael, and the work of SFIC and also DCG. It's really gratifying to see people coming together with a common purpose, building housing. It's always been a passion of mine and the work that we do at HKIT. Today, I'd like to, as Landis mentioned, I'll talk a little bit about who we are and our role, where we fit in this team of folks to build development. And then I'm going to share a few of the examples of projects we've done over the last few years, and share some lessons learned through those projects. As I mentioned, I'm Paul McElwee, HKIT Architects. Been practicing for over 25 years here in the Bay Area. My focus has always been on housing ever since the student of architecture. It's really been, for me, most critical need that we have as a society, especially here in the Bay Area. It goes without saying. So I've dedicated myself and my career to developing housing, especially for those who are the most vulnerable. Seniors, affordable housing, special needs housing are pretty much exclusively the work that I do with HKIT Architects. I'm more than just an architect. I consider myself to be a houser, involved in the broader community of developers of affordable housing. We meet at conferences regularly, advocate for policy, and so on and so forth. So it's really a group effort, and my experience also includes working with faith-based organizations, which I'll share with you today. HKIT Architects, we were founded in the Bay Area in 1948, Richardson, Don Komatsu. And here they are, early projects, early affordable housing of the 1950s. And that's been part of HKIT's legacy for the last 75 years. We've been working with a broad constellation of nonprofit affordable housing developers. And this is a kind of a long list, and these are clients we've worked with again and again over the years. You could see many of these have roots in congregation or faith-based organizations. We've got Christian church homes, Ecumenical Association for Housing, and so forth. There's sort of a long history of that connection with nonprofit developers, and also a lot of local organizations. There's groups that are working in Napa Valley exclusively, or East Bay, Baldsey, and so on and so forth, Chinatown. So these companies do incredible work. The very difficult task of building housing at all in the Bay Area, let alone housing that relies on a patchwork of public funds and subsidies and so forth. So these folks are really heroic in the work that they do and make great partners. And we're really happy that they're our clients. So what do? We, as mentioned, we do a lot of the research and the planning and the design of the project from the early inception. We come in with your vision as it's evolving, and we talked about like the vision coming to consensus as a congregation. We can come in at that point and help to embellish that vision and bring it forth. That's in the planning. So really there's three main parts. There's the planning phase through planning approvals, then our middle part where we do building permits, all the work that takes place as far as budgeting, getting to the point of starting construction on budget. And then the third part is we're there all the way through construction. So for the 18 months, 2 years, we will be there weekly on site, making sure the construction is going smoothly. And we're going to be an advocate for the ministry and also the nonprofit developer. I think, to be clear, our contract as an architect is with a developer. So we'll be working through a nonprofit developer. But the ministry is going to be a partner, a stakeholder. So for us, the ministry is equally important as the developer client. So it's a bit of an unusual role for an architect where we have multiple stakeholders, and it's something we've had to really learn and incorporate that into our communication. So as I mentioned, what is that point of engagement? And it's that moment when there's a decision to move towards housing. There's a vision, but maybe it's not quite so clear. An organization like SFIC, DCG, might bring us on board. It could be through one of our nonprofit client partners who has already made contact with the congregation. It could be with the congregation directly. We've also made contact, and then we bring in the rest of the team at that point. But if you have a vision of housing, you may not know how many units you want to build. You may not know who the population is going to be, families, seniors, special needs. We can help visualize that and help with that decision-making process. And we can help also to bring in partners as well. This is a bit of a flow chart showing the early phase, really showing us coming into the project at a point where the vision is starting to be established. We're going to work on what we call a feasibility study. I'll talk about feasibility study in a minute. And that's a chance where we really get to know the congregation, get to know your vision, get to know the site you have, and look at the laws and regulations that will dictate what you can and can't build. We also have a role to play in community engagement, which we assume is going to be a very important part of the approvals prior to going to the city and working for approvals in the planning department. Okay. So what is a feasibility analysis, a site study? We're going to be looking at the available land. This is an example of a study that we did in Santa Cruz for a congregation that had quite a bit of land on their church, and looking at the options that they have, the opportunities they have to develop. We looked at the sun, the wind, the views, noise, transit, traffic, where the trash comes from, where there's traffic in the morning, what the disposition of the neighbors are. Are these neighbors who are industrial? Are they single family homes? They may have a different view of the project. We also want to make sure we're identifying anything it's a no build, a setback. A setback is saying you have to set back a building from a certain distance on property line, or an easement where there's something underground, like a pipe that you can't build over. We're going to research all of that to the best of our ability at the beginning. A lot of information is available online about zoning, just to explain zoning to everyone. So zoning, it's basically what you can and can't build from the perspective of the neighborhood. There's two kinds of permits. You get a planning permit, which really is how big of a building, where it can be built, how it can be built, what it can do. And then there's a building permit, which is what is dealing with life safety. So the zoning dictates the planning permit. So we're going to do this research, and we can get a lot of information online about the size and shape of the site and what's permitted there. We will prepare a summary of the zoning and bring all these pieces of data together to give us a clear idea of what is legally allowed. But this is not really as simple as that. There's a lot more complexity because of overlay districts. There's special laws and special general plan provisions that might override the zoning. There's also state laws like the SB4, which folks may have heard of, which is just been in effect for a few months now, which actually overrides zoning. In the case of houses of worship, it's a really beneficial law because it opens up the ability to build housing on any site that is owned by a nonprofit entity. So this is the kind of zoning analysis we could do, really bringing to bear our experience and our knowledge of what's happening currently in the housing market. And here's sort of when we get through our research, our data gathering, getting done, know the congregation, we'll prepare a study of this nature, which is really a way to figure out, okay, this is what we can fit. Here's the vision. Here's an example. We look at the parking, the access, open space, how do pieces go together. This is a master plan site. It could be one building. And really to figure out, well, what are the units we can build? And then we can also do options. We can say, okay, well, here's an option if we're building studios for seniors. Here's an option if we're doing families and we need to have more parking, more open space. So we could provide alternate 1, alternate 2 as a way to help you decide in your vision who you want to serve and the size and scale of your development. And once we have within the congregation, partnerships, stakeholders, an initial vision, then we go out into the community. And this is one of the areas in my experience where having a faith-based partner in the development team is really an advantage because you already know the community. You're already established in the community. You speak well and you have trust of the neighbors. And that, for us, has made the community engagement process a lot more productive. Here's some examples of in-person meetings we've done over the last few years. We've also done virtual. But we really try to meet the residents from the very beginning without a whole lot of drawings, just to get to know folks and where are they from, what are their ambitions. And then we come back a second time and a third time to get to a point where everyone's happy with the project. And then maybe they won't all be happy, but at least we get to the point where we get the trust of the community and we're able to move forward. I mentioned the 2 permits, past our planning approval, we're going to work on the building permit process. And this can be a pretty onerous process. This little chart here illustrates the time frame that this process could take from our first meeting to start a construction. It could take 1.5 years. It could take 2 years. It could take 5 years. And there's a lot of variables involved. Part of it has to do with each city is different. So the planning approval might take longer in one city than another, depending on their process. Each city has their own building department. They're all following the same state building code, but there's different interpretations and different processes depending on the city. So this alongside the realities of building with affordable housing, where there may be annual tax credits or other things that can cause a project to go on hold, waiting for funding. So it's really important that we all have patience, we have flexibility, that a project may go on hold, it'll come back, and you just got to stick with it. It's not a simple process. We also often work with a contractor during this phase as well. The construction model of designing a set of a building to completion, then sending it out to bid of various contractors is one way. Often when we work with nonprofit developers, we do what's called negotiated bids. So we bring the contractor in early on in the design, and we work with them for months and months and months before construction. And that's done to help with cost certainty. We're checking the budget at each step along the way, so there's no surprise at the end, as opposed to just sending it out and hoping you get a good bid. And this is really tied to the nature of funding of housing, and it really helps with the closing of financing. Okay, some case studies of projects we've done in the past, and wanted to share first a project we're doing in San Francisco. This is a San Francisco-based event, and this is the development we did with the Franciscan Friars of St. Boniface in the Tenderloin. The St. Anthony Foundation was an organization founded in 1950, which was an urban feeding program, a soup kitchen, if you will, but they served thousands of meals a day. This is a picture of their dining room at the corner of Golden Gate and Jones in Tenderloin, which had been operating for over 50 years. And at this point, they contacted us, HKIT Architects, to design a new dining room. And the city said, well, why don't you do housing also? I'm going to build a brand new dining room. Why replace a two-story building with a two-story building? Build a new one. So what we did is a partnership was formed with Mercy Housing to do senior housing above their dining room program. So the mission of the dining room was able to continue with the addition of housing above by building on top. This is called building air rights. So it's free land. It's on top of another property. Basically, Mercy Housing owns the land above St. Anthony Foundation's dining room. This is examples of our design process. You know, being in the city, it's a very complex three-dimensional site. These are pictures of groundbreaking. You can maybe make out Nancy Pelosi there. And the construction. You can see the friary on the far right there of St. Boniface. And really, one of the things that's come up often is when we have housing and we have a house of worship or services from a house of worship, how do we create distinct entrances and identity? So on the far right, you'll see Vera Hale Senior Housing is the lobby for the apartments. There's 91 senior apartments on those floors above. And then St. Anthony Foundation has its own entrance with a covered arcade. So people queue up in the morning once a day for meal service. And you can see how these two are able to coexist. This is the new dining room. Lessons learned. I mentioned air rights. It is interesting. You get free land, but there's lots of challenges. You know, for instance, like who owns the elevator? Where does the trash go? There's lots of sharing, cost sharing, and split that has to be negotiated carefully, and also a condominium agreement. But really, you know, for us, it was building the housing, but equally important was maintaining the function of the church and the services that they provide. Just to pivot to a development we worked on in San Jose with Mid-Penn Housing. We were contacted by Mid-Penn Housing, nonprofit developer client of ours, in partnership with the Lutheran Church, Evangelical Church. They had a sort of a beautiful mid-century modern building down off the freeway in San Jose with these sort of swooping arches and lovely sanctuary space. But unfortunately, the congregation had gone down to 10 individuals, and they had tremendous debt that they were trying to work through. So this partnership with Mid-Penn really was for them a way to preserve the finances of the ministry and be able to carry on into the future. This particular ministry already had housing. They had a senior senior age-restricted department that they had already operated, and they wanted to extend their mission to include really vulnerable occupants who were experiencing homelessness or coming out of homelessness. They had an ambitious vision to do 110 units of housing, which you can imagine 110 units of formerly homeless housing in a neighborhood is probably going to raise some concern with the neighbors. And we had a lot of community outreach, lots of meetings. And again, the work of the Mid-Penn developers, going out in the neighborhood in teams with members of the congregation, just going door to door. They did an incredible job of engaging the community and bringing folks around to be supporters of the project. The sanctuary, which is this cross-shaped building, just sort of right of center, was attached to a flex space or a fellowship hall that was being used for a variety of functions. This church, in addition to the housing they were doing homework programs, they were doing daycare, they were doing some feeding there. They had a really ambitious set of mission services they were providing, and they had to pare it down. They really had to decide this area here in the red was the size of their fellowship hall, and now we're getting into this yellow space, which was what was decided to be the ultimate space for the flex space. So Mid-Penn housing included a shell of space that could be used by the church. Currently, the congregation is building out this space within their new flex space, but they had to downsize. This is an image that we drew of the flex space. Give them an idea of how we could do something small, but it would be flexible. It would be off of a courtyard, so you could open up the doors and have a larger space, and it could accommodate a variety of functions. Here's pictures of the building as it was designed and completed. And again, we took cues from the mid-century modern style of the sanctuary, using similar materials, shapes, patterns, so we would have something that felt like it was part of an overall campus. This is the building as it's been constructed. And there's now 110 occupants right now. They have Santa Clara County Social Services has offices here. They provide support. This is I think got 6 offices of support services for the residents there. Lessons learned here. Talked about really the community outreach was critical. The bringing in the functions of the church into the future in a new space was very critical. We also learned that when we touched the old flex space, it was actually attached to an old chapel, and cutting off that piece attached to an existing building proved to be one of the most difficult parts of the project. You're thinking about building. If you demolish a building completely and build something new, that's simple. If you're cutting off a part of a building and you're patching it or touching it or redoing it, that's where things can get dicey, because there's unknown costs there. You have to bring it up to current code. And so in this project, that was definitely a lesson learned for us. Just want to share one more case study. This was, we had there was a DCG event a few months ago with Phil Brochard from All Souls Church, and this is his project. We were contacted by, again, another one of our longtime clients, Satellite Affordable Housing Associates, or SAHA. And they had made contact with the Episcopal Church, and we work with them in their sanctuary space to create the vision that they had. And again, we came in as they had realized, okay, we're ready for housing, but they didn't know which kind. So we showed them what was possible. And we also showed them the functions that they would need as a church. So we have office spaces for the church plus housing here. We also worked with them in this neighborhood in North Berkeley, which was frankly more affluent neighborhood with lots of big historic houses. So we worked very carefully to do a building that would, in this case, blend into this particular site. You can see it looks quite different from our last building, and that's really intentional. We worked with the church very extensively, and they had folks on their leadership team who had strong opinions of design. There was an architect as well we worked with to come up with a building that we were all happy with, that would fit naturally into this historic neighborhood, and really create this courtyard space that was both part of the housing and also used by the church as well. They even brought in an artist who does these labyrinths to do this labyrinth pattern in the concrete. The lessons learned here, being for us, there was a lot of wouldn't say marriage counseling, but trying to bring together our developer and congregation and facilitate communication work within neighborhoods who are very, very sensitive to their values and style. Okay. Just to wrap it up and just kind of summarize, how do you select an architect? Well, I'm a little bit biased, but I think from these examples I've shown, just to kind of summarize, you really want to have a firm that has experience with housing, not just housing, but affordable housing, which is its own unique animal, as it were. You want to have a firm that has experience with community outreach, consensus building. It's going to be a very important part of the process. And an architect that also worked with multiple stakeholders in the past and is used to that process. So with that, I'm gonna stop talking. Happy to take your questions.
So Paul, I want to just, before we get to Q&A, just have a brief dialogue with you. First of all, thank you very much. You can stop sharing, I think. It's been a fantastic, there's a lot of information that was thrown at folks, and I'm glad it's recorded, because as a community, your head could be spinning with just all the slides that have been presented, but go back and review this with your internal teams, because it really does a great job of laying out the sequence and the process. So one thing that we're advocating for here is for the faith community to be able to engage you prior to bringing in a developer. And I'll explain to you why. We understand that if a faith community goes to a developer, and there are some fantastic developers, we work with a lot of the people on your list earlier that you showed that you work with. Sometimes if it goes straight from the community to the developer, then they're going to engage everyone. And at that point, there really isn't an opportunity to slow the train down to appropriately allow the community to understand what's happening. So they're forced to be in a position to learn as they go, which is never advisable. So in this case, or what we are advocating for is for them to, when they have that notion of housing, and after they've just done some high-level assessment of can our site support housing, to engage an architect prior. Because what then we believe is them engaging an architect prior to selecting a developer allows them to, number one, coalesce around a vision. Number two, settle on who they want to serve. Because and I'm going to go there with you, because sometimes you'll get, I'm going to use a church as an example, even though this is open to all faith communities. I'm just going to use a church as an example. I'm in the church. We want to do housing. We just know we have land. And we know we want to get involved because there are a lot of vulnerable folks that need housing. We're not sure if we want to do seniors or special needs or veterans or family. We just have land. And what can you do to help us land on what the programming could be, for instance? And I'm being a little leading, because certain designs will drive a certain level of density, and also funding opportunities will have something to do with that. But if we're basically agnostic to who comes into the housing, we just want it to be affordable or workforce. How do you help us figure that out? And the reason I want to know that is because then that should drive who we partner with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to your point, I mean, we come in at any point. We could be working directly with the congregation, with whoever would contact us. But I think, yeah, like you say, it really for us is we look to see what will fit, and regardless of what it is or who's living there. The codes for residential are they're sort of one size fits all when you do multifamily. So we're going to do all of our research to find, what is kind of the biggest, most efficient box we can get. How many units can we get in a way that's the right fit? And once we have, the shell, then how much space we have, how we break that shell up is those are the options we can present. I mean, and so the question of population, like you say, it might be the site may lend itself to a certain population. If you don't have a lot of open space, for instance, it's probably not that great for families. Being access to transit's really important for seniors. So I think what we can do is we can very early on, we can provide an image of what can be built as far as the overall. And then with that, we could say, okay, well, if you're going to go with all studio apartments for transition age youth, you could get 50 apartments here and you'd have this much parking. If we're going to do large family or whatever, we can sort of provide those scenarios to a congregation and give them a vision of what's possible. And I would hope that would make the decision-making process a lot smoother.
So I'm playing the role of the administrator. We have a few folks that really just want to provide a bunch of 3 bedrooms. What trade-offs are there? Because we hear a lot about micro apartments or studios, but what about families? And so am I going to still be able to, is there a difference in how many units I'm going to be able to get? What are the trade-offs?
Absolutely. I mean, if we had just our examples from our own projects, we've done like the project we saw in San Jose, 110 very small studio apartments for folks coming out of homelessness. So with that, we assume that there's not going to be a lot of folks owning cars. They may have bicycles. The small units are going to be enough for an individual who's coming out of homelessness. So that really shapes what we can do. Okay, with 110 apartments, we really only need 20, 30 parking stalls. And that's something it's from the zoning code from the city, but there's laws that override that, but then there's also just common sense. So like in your example, you're talking about 3-bedroom units. If we're building a row of townhomes, for instance, the planning code, first of all, is probably going to require more parking. The parking requirements from cities tend to be tied to the size of units. So if you're a 1-bedroom unit, they're going to say you need 1 parking stall. If it's 2-bedroom, 1.5, 3-bedroom, or 2 parking stalls. So if you're doing 23 bedrooms, do the math, 60 stalls, whatever. But again, there's lots of exceptions and rules and affordable housing and incentives that would allow you to cut that down. But the reality is, if you're building in Vallejo, 20 units, 3-bedroom, you're going to need a car. You're going to have a family that's probably going to have 2 cars, frankly. So it's being realistic. If you've got a site that has the land for that parking and it's a good location and schools and this, that, and the other thing, yeah, that's great for families. But if you're trying to put a family housing right downtown where there's really no room for parking without a very expensive underground garage or something like that, then probably not the best place for housing for families.
So we're in San Francisco and we have 2 options. We have one site it's on the hillside, and then we have another site that's, probably a 1/4 acre. So, we don't have the luxury of having just a lot of land like some of the organizations across the bridges. But in our case, is it possible to build vertically in such a confined space, and what are the trade-offs? Does it cost more money? Is it a tougher to design?
We've had projects in San Francisco where they're families, and ideally it's really about open space. Kids need to get outside. They need to be able to have access to play space. In a corridor building, it can be tricky for family housing. Kids are running in the corridors, and so. But it is San Francisco, and we do need to really maximize space. So right now we're building 200 and something units in Potrero Hill. You've probably seen coming up the freeway. It's a single block and 2 buildings. They're corridor buildings around a large central courtyard. And it's a very sloped site, like many in San Francisco. It goes up 9 stories up the hillside. And we spent a lot of time designing very carefully sort of this terraced outdoor area that has a variety of different uses of play structures. There's outdoor seating, all these things that you really have to have living in the city. If you're in an apartment building in a corridor with families and kids, it's just critical. That project also had a sort of built-in little mini park that was open to the public, so they had even more play space for the families. So I think family housing, you got to have the open space. It's just really critical, not for anybody, but especially for families. And then parking, really is more. So in that case, with the hillside, we do have garage parking. I think we also have the mechanical parking stackers, which seem pretty extravagant, but compared to the cost of land, they can actually be pretty efficient. And for families, they can be a good solution.
So and this will be my last question, and we'll open it up for Q&A. So what I'm taking away from that is the site itself will have a lot to say about who should live there. So even if we are locked into a vision, our site, based on its geography, based on its size, may have certain constraints that may be easier and may be more cost effective to build a certain type of housing that may not require parking, that may allow us to do studios or one bedrooms just because of where the site sits. So with that being said, the last question, and then we'll open it up, is what if, and this is just more of a brainstorm for you, but are there some questions that we could be kind of processing ourselves, coalescing around, or thinking about prior to engaging you that would make the process a little bit more efficient? Some of the things that you would, that you would encourage us to already kind of have started some conversations before we bring you in.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I think with any house of worship, there's going to be a leadership group. There's going to be a burning soul who really wants to take this on. And to the extent that that group is already coalesced and they're ready to move forward, we've come in pretty early. Like, for instance, when we worked with All Souls, there was already some individuals in the leadership team who, builders, architects, they were kind of talking about this already and starting to get their vision together. So when we came in, that was already really established, that they had their mind focused on housing, didn't know exactly what it was going to be or who they were going to serve. Yeah, I'm trying to think, what else could you do in advance to prepare?
Well, we'll just let the questions flow. I know Michael's going to have some, he might prompt us.
Yeah.
Landis, those are amazing questions and important questions, and this is not a shy group, and so we've got a queue of questions. Before I begin asking them, I just wanted to make two comments. One is I was very impressed with your client list, and it shows that you're probably doing some supportive housing and transitional housing for homeless, as well as senior housing. I saw Episcopal Community Services, I saw Salvation Army, I saw Glide. I mean, these are our constituents, and the other thing I wanted to mention too was I remember when they were raising money for St. Anthony's way back, and they did all of this without any public money, if memory serves me correctly.
That's correct, yeah.
I didn't know you were the architect, but I wanted to commend you because I always thought that covered walkway and that arcade was so important when the clients queue up for meals. And I recently had the opportunity to go and tour the facility. It is stellar. You did a wonderful job.
Oh, thank you.
From my friend Reverend Penny Nixon, she asks, when you talk about community engagement, are you talking about the congregation or the neighbors or both?
Both. We have many meetings with, for example, with the All Souls group. We met with their congregation leadership team 2, 3, 4 times before having our first community meeting. I mean, we want to make sure that we're all comfortable. So we had weekly meetings with Saha, one member of All Souls leadership, on a weekly basis. And then every month or so, we would have a meeting with their whole leadership. I would go over there. We set up a screen and projector in the basement of the church. We talk through the design and get them on board. Then we do the community engagement. And I say community engagement, it was a really broad process. I mean, Saha and All Souls, they were doing outreach to local politicians, talking to council members, and then they scheduled events that were noticed throughout the neighborhood, everything, multiple media, make sure we get something mailed, and also, email, so forth. And that's the community engagement that happened with the neighbors. And that at the time was, anyway, not to get into the weeds, but we did 3 meetings with the neighborhood to get everyone familiar with the project.
The theme of your talk is how to select an architect, and that was a piece of it. Can we flip it for a moment and ask who would be the ideal client?
That is a good question too.
I mean, how prepared do they need to be, and what do they need to provide the architect in order to really effectively make use of the architect's time?
Yeah, I think I mentioned before. I think if the congregation, if they have their own ducks in a row in terms of the leadership and the vision, that makes it easier for us. You know, we've also worked, I mean, frankly, in the case of St. Anthony's, I mean, there were many decision makers there, and we work with them, but it did take more time versus having one person who just speaks on behalf of the church, and so you kind of move forward with that. But just in terms of nuts and bolts, I mean, simple stuff like if there's a bunch of rolled up floor plans in the closet that they have, you know, we're going to have to pull all that out. You know, we're going to need to just physically survey the space. So, I mean, those are all things that, you know, they seem pretty simple, but they could take us a little bit of time on the upfront. So, you know, we might send an intern over there to go through their closets and make sure we get all the drawings and information. We might do some permit research. If they have a title report or any kind of legal document that might talk about their the property description or easements or any kind of legal restrictions, that would be very helpful to have in hand. So, you know, some of those, you know, more sort of technical things would be good to have prepped ahead of time.
I have a ton of questions I'd like to ask, but we've got so many here, so we'll work through. And Landis, at the end, if there's anything that you want to add, just chime in. From Marta Stuthers, glad to hear you say a church needs to hire or engage an architect. Two questions. How do you help the church select the developer? Is the architect the mediator between the church and the developer, or does someone else become the advocate for the church?
Yeah, interesting questions.
So Paul, I can help with that.
Go for it.
My lane.
That's your
Maybe
forte.
I'll take that one.
Yeah.
Okay.
We think the church should either hire their architect directly and RFP for a developer through a process, and we think that lands on what's the values of the organization, what type of project they're going to be wanting to build. Paul did a great job of laying out some of the considerations, but I think the architect is there to play a critical role, but I think they can help the church understand the strengths and weaknesses of different developers. And if there's an interview process, I think the architect should sit on that committee and help interview and then have those conversations after. But the church should be driving that process with the assist from the architect and the church's owner rep.
Yeah, I think exactly. Yeah, and same for the contractor. I mean, this negotiated bid process, I mean, we don't pick the contractor. We're working under the owner, but if they're selecting a contractor as part of an interview process, you know, we certainly can be part of that, and we could share our own experience working with these developers in the past or these contractors in the past, but really it is the decision of the church.
Now, from Nancy Wecker, can you speak to the issue of utilizing an area within the existing building to provide limited temporary housing for an individual or family where there's already a kitchen and a bathroom, the elevator needs to be fixed for accessibility, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I think as I mentioned before, I mean, there's a lot of potential for remodel. You know, it gives you a huge head start versus having to do brand new and ground up construction. But the devil really is in the code compliance, and to have an occupancy permit from the building department of any city, there's going to be inspections. They're going to make sure that all these code required things are installed. And we're talking about the space. You're talking about that was built in 1980, that's one thing, but if it was built in 1920, it's a different thing. And if, you know, if we're adding sprinklers, if we're adding fire alarms, it can get expensive, but, you know, maybe still a lot more effective than trying to build new. So not a simple answer. We'd really have to inspect and give you kind of a sense of what might be required by the city.
It seems appropriate to sort of interject at this point because your whole presentation included lessons learned. I know Landis and I have been on this journey, and I would be really curious to see what some of the challenges of working with historic properties are. I know that we along the way learned a little bit about the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, which technically is a federal act which allows you to go around some of the CEQA laws. I know that the new legislation that's just been passed statewide is fast tracking things. But in terms of historic preservation, what are some of the challenges you've had to work with some of those congregations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, a building could be truly on a historic register, and that's a whole separate discussion. We haven't had that situation, but we've had buildings that are older, historical, and again, I think from a cost certainty point of view, it's always simpler to, okay, we're going to completely demolish this, we're going to completely build this, because a contractor can come in and say it's going to cost us this much to knock this down, it's going to cost this much to build a new one. And getting into historical, great. If we can do an adaptive reuse, it's saves money, it's good for the environment, but we really have to get in there and see what's involved. How much plumbing upgrades are needed, electrical and fire and so forth. It could really vary depending again on the age and the size of the structure. Does that answer your question? Was there
It does. It does. And you also have the element too of the people who are just so attached to certain things and having to be sensitive to that in terms of design and the like. From Albert Fraser, he asks, who is responsible for the pre-development or early on costs, especially if the project is delayed or doesn't ultimately pencil out, especially for those seeking workforce housing? How can the risk be mitigated?
This is a really common situation. We're looking at a relationship that's going to last for 4 years or more, potentially working with the client. So that work early on that takes us a week or two. I mean, it's such a small thing. I mean, we do it at no cost or low cost. I mean, it's really we understand that there's no project yet, and we don't want to take people's resources and something that's not going to happen. So let's just put it all out there at the beginning. At the point where we as architects, we're putting in a lot of time, we're bringing in consultants. So it's not just us as the architecture firm. We're also going to bring in civil engineer, mechanical engineers, structural engineers, so on and so forth. So when that process starts, when we get more into that, then we're really committing some finances and funds. But up to that point, it just doesn't make sense for us to to waste finances on a project that really hasn't been established yet. So we kind of want to go gradually. And even once the project does move forward, let's not say, okay, we're going to enter into a contract that's going to be for the next 4 years. Let's just enter into a contract that's between now and getting approvals of the project in a few months. And so you're kind of paying as you go, more gradual. It's a little bit more of a cautious approach in terms of the finances.
And I want to just piggyback.
Yeah, go ahead.
So
go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, Michael.
No, I just wanted to ask Landis because I know that you're dealing with this. And can you also speak to the issue of phases?
Right, and that's the whole point of this series that you've put on, Michael, because you're telling the organizations, go through this process iteratively and then check in with these professionals before you fully launch into a project. And so Paul shared in his presentation, go back and look at the recording, a charrette, and it was really saying what can go here, what can go. I think it was a church in San Jose, where you shown that you just drew it out. That saves cost. You will hear from a financial consultant later in the series that talks about the financial components. And so what we're saying is there a there? Yes. The architect can fit the sites. The financial consultants talks about, well, how do you pay for it? The lawyer is going to come in and talk about whether the legal implications. The developer is going to talk about their process. We advocate that until all those conversations are had and understood fully, then you no longer are blind, and then you launch into your project. What happens when projects get paused or stopped or they're over budget is because someone's moving too fast, and all the appropriate data points are not better understood to know what those risks are. So if you do pause, you should, everything that takes place in the future, whether even if it's getting the challenges of getting permits, your team should know what's going to happen when it happens. There should be no surprises.
Okay, and here from Eric Johnson. What are some of the vital community spaces intentionally created in projects, especially those that are multiple stories, high density housing, where the interaction between residents is either challenging or limited due to the constraints of building up instead of building out?
Yeah, I mean, again, it comes to those open spaces. We're in California, so people really are going to spend a lot more time outside, and so our buildings in an urban setting will always have a courtyard or a rooftop garden or some kind of green space, even if there's really nothing available on the ground. And for the most part, all of our the housing developments that we work on that are service-based, have staff and have management and so forth, they'll have a community room that'll be just a dual flex space with a little kitchenette, some storage, and people can have events there. Usually we put the community room next to the courtyard, so you get sort of double duty, double space. That's really the heart of the community. There's, of course, the lobby and the mailroom too, but we look for that moment in every development where we have a heart that has a landscaped area that becomes that meeting place that brings residents together. Because otherwise, it's just a corridor and a bunch of doors. Really, we're trying to create those community building spaces. And then when we're working with the church, sometimes or any house of worship, we're able to get some synergy there. Like I showed that example of All Souls that had the courtyard that was defined by the housing. It was also the church. They had a community space and an office in there too. So it was really kind of completely shared between the two, and it was a great way to have those two populations have a shared space.
Landis, I wanted to ask, you might be able to answer this better. I don't know you or Paul. We have 3 houses of worship, adjacent neighbors up on Cathedral Hill. And Landis and I have walked those properties and we've met the faith leaders before. You've been talking, Paul, a lot about air rights. Can one property sell the airspace to another property? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's just like it sounds. You're sort of making a stack of pancakes. I mean, a property, when you have a property, theoretically, that property, I forget. I mean, I think it goes up 500 feet in the air. It's like legally owned by on that parcel, but you could sell parts of that off. Yeah, it was a learning process for me, realizing this was possible. And it's like any other condominium. So if you have a condominium building and you're basically just slicing off pieces that are owned by different people, this is just turning it on its head. So you just got the levels are owned by different owners. But the complexity with that too is it's like, well, you're on top of somebody. So like, well, you got to get down to the street. You got to go through somebody else's space. So it's not just, like a stack of pancakes and then there's one owned on, there's nothing, they don't touch each other. And then you have to actually create an easement through that other property. So, that example with St. Anthony Foundation, they've got the first 3 floors and the housing above. Well, the folks in the housing, they have a trash chute. So the trash is going to go down in the basement. They have a trash room in the basement, which their staff has to access, but it's not their property. So they've actually created a condominium agreement and we drew diagrams and color-coded maps to say, this is owned by St. Anthony. This is owned by Mercy Housing. This is shared. This is not shared, and that really defined this legal agreement. It was translated into writing and into the deed of the property, and they managed to coexist on top of each other.
Lance, you want to add anything on that? Okay, we're good. Again, from Marta, I'm asking these questions in the order they were given. Can you speak to why the color scheme for Jordan Court is so terrible? Oh my goodness. Too cool, and it doesn't complement the church or neighboring apartment buildings. My goodness.
I will say that we worked very closely with the congregation, in particular an architect on the congregation had very, very, very strong opinions about design and had a really strong involvement in selecting the colors.
Okay. In a congregation, you have 2 gathered, 3 ideas. Here we go. From our friend, Reverend Anna Marie Booth. Years ago, my father, Reverend Venchel Booth, led the Zion Baptist Church congregation in Cincinnati, Ohio, to sponsor housing. Zion Care Center Nursing Home, 1967. Shelton Gardens, a low-income facility for seniors in 1968. Reed's Valley View Manor, the Walker Apartments, and she goes on. What federal programs still exist to support such developments?
Oh, federal programs. Wow, that's
Well, we have I'll just jump in on that one.
Yeah.
There will be a session where we have financial consultants that will talk about available capital sources. So that's an upcoming installment.
Yeah. The short answer is there's not much from the federal government these days. It's not like the 70s and 80s. It's more money is coming from the state and county.
Okay. From Manson Lung, how much architect involvement in community is there involved with community engagement, especially when it is much anticipation of the height of the building within the neighborhood?
Yeah, like Sean, we're going to be at every community engagement session. If there's questions about the landscaping, we'll bring in our landscape architect. When there's concerns about views and light and air, we will model the building. We showed some of these 3D computer models. We'll model everything to scale, and we're able to actually run the sun path certain latitude and make sure that, like this is where your shadows are going to be cast. This is where your views are going to be impacted. We try to be really transparent and as realistic as possible with that, so people understand what's involved.
Okay. How early on in the process do you address the funding issue to both make sure a project is in fact feasible, but also that funding is available and locked in? Do churches generally maintain control over their property, even if they are not the primary funder for the project? Good
I'm
question.
going to turn that over to Landis.
The easy ones, right?
Yeah, it's a great question, actually. And again, just another plug for this session, because we will have everyone that will be able to answer that question from their respective discipline here at a future installment. But to answer the question directly, we believe that you want to understand what we call sources. Sources are where does the capital come for construction, and the uses, how does that capital get spent as well as operating. You want to understand that before you hit go. So if you think about it from a setting up a project for success, how it's funded is important to understand. What are the legal implications to ownership? And so some landowners will lease the property. Some of them will do a joint venture with a developer and maintain a legal relationship on the property. So how that legal formation is decided, and then how the capital comes together are all questions we believe should be answered before you actually sign away the development rights. And we will be able to answer those with each subsequent session. But again, we don't want you to partner with someone and hit go and then not have those questions answered. And we had a session when we did this housing. We did one in San Francisco, we did one in Hayward. At the Hayward conference in person, there were two churches. One had an understanding of all these moving pieces and were able to establish themselves through their own vision, and one didn't know. And it was a tale of two different legal circumstances as well as financial participation.
Thank you. We have reached the end of our program. I wanted to, I'd be remiss if I didn't, number one, thank all of the attendees who are here. And in particular, if you would permit me to single out, we want to welcome Bishop-elect Austin Rios, who is joining us, and I believe from Rome. He will be the next bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of California, and we've worked very closely with his predecessor, Bishop Andrus. And so Bishop Rios, we welcome you and we look forward to working with you. And may your ministry be blessed here. We want to thank Paul and Landis and the team over at DCG. We're kind of tied at the hip with DCG, and we're grateful for it. And we believe we're doing something good for the city and county of San Francisco and for our congregations who are on this journey. And we want to thank everybody for their participation in this second segment of the series entitled The Ministry of Housing. We look forward to reconnecting next week when we will examine the theme, the financing piece. We encourage you to help spread the word and invite friends and colleagues to join us. This concludes today's program. Have a blessed rest of your day.